I've started our recording.
Okay, so before we get started, for anybody wanting to join in and use Slack, we have our URL up on the screen now. Octopus.com/Slack will get you joined into our community Slack channels. And we have a webinar channel set up, webinar-spaces and workers. And we can chat there and answer any questions you have as well.
And Ryan, you'll be monitoring that for us.
I will. I'm gonna play moderator today. I'll be looking for questions, and then I'll bring those up to Bob and Derek throughout the webinar.
Awesome. Perfect. All right, it's 9 o'clock my time. What time is it, Derek?
Yeah, I've got 3 p.m. Let's kick off.
All right, sounds good to me. All right, thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar on speeding up, scaling out, and organizing your Octopus Deploy server using spaces and workers. My name is Bob Walker. Joining me today is Derek Campbell.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
And Ryan Russo.
Hello, hello.
And we are solution architects at Octopus Deploy, focused on customer success in the US and Europe. We added workers this summer, and we are about to release spaces next month. So we wanted to do this webinar to help show how useful these new features are to our Octopus customers. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we dive in. A link of the recording will be emailed to you, so don't worry about trying to frantically take notes. In addition, as Ryan mentioned, we have our community Slack channel, which Ryan will be monitoring. And you can join that by doing https://octopus.com/slack. That link will be in the bottom part of almost all our slides, so don't worry about trying to memorize that. If you do join us on Slack, please do include an introduction, like name, company, where you're from, everything like that. Over on Zoom, we'll be monitoring that as well. If you could use the Q&A, that would be awesome. It just helps us keep track of all the questions as they're coming in. But if you do want to use the chat, we'll be monitoring that as well. Just make note that by default, any chat messages you send out by default will only go to all panelists. It won't go to everybody, so we might get a lot of duplicate questions that way. I'd like to dive in with an agenda. So Spaces, Derek's first going to talk to you about Spaces and how they can be used to organize your Octopus Deploy server a little bit better. And then I'm going to take over and I'll talk to you a little bit about workers and how you can use them to improve performance and scale out your Octopus Deploy server. And then we'll wrap it up with some questions. That being said, periodically, Ryan will interject with a couple of questions just to make sure if there's any big questions we want to answer right away. Sometimes we might get to those questions later in the demo. If we can, we'll do our very best to answer questions at the very end, but we'll probably hang around our Slack channel to answer any final remaining questions. All right, Derek, Spaces.
Excellent. Thanks, Bob.
Yeah,
Spaces. Let's focus on what matters. So the first slide, this is our, Bob, you'll be familiar with this one. This is our demo instance of Octopus.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time in there. As you can see on the left-hand side, it's actually not as many as some, but as you can see, it gets very, very busy. You've got a whole bunch. This is a GIF, I just want to be upfront. But as you can see, as you're scrolling through, it really does get quite messy and very, very busy for your administrators. Obviously, there's certain things you can do to mitigate this, but as an administrator, you tend to find that you see everything anyway. So yeah, in addition to that, the infrastructure tab, this is something I see quite often where you just have endless scrolling infrastructure. You know, when you have 100, 200, 300 deployment targets, and I've got some customers that have up to 40,000, I'm sure you can imagine this gets very, very busy. Do you see this a lot? Do you see this a lot with your clients, Bob?
Yeah, especially with some of our customers, they have in the thousands range. And so this gets very busy in trying to keep track of everything.
Yeah, as well as that, what I also see as well is namespacing of environments, such as like project one dev, client one dev as well. And that happens, if I'm not going to lie, happens more often than I care to admit.
Yeah, that doesn't scale too well because it makes your dashboard look really funky at that point.
It doesn't scale at all. And this is obviously where Spaces has some really nice features. So the main benefit initially, well, Spaces will effectively give you a way to organize your teams and your spaces neatly into one Octopus server. What I often see is organizations that have more than one Octopus server, and standard license, for instance, has the ability to have up to 3 separate instances. So often what I see is separated between dev, test, and production, or even just test and then production. And what Spaces will be able to do is you'll be able to fit in more, you'll be able to separate out things much, much easier. For instance, you would be able to use a sandbox to really kind of isolate, things that you're doing on certain Octopus servers. And the good thing is almost everything now exists within a space. This is projects, environments, deployment targets, tenants, libraries, and so forth. And what I mean by libraries is anything under the library tab. That could well be certificates, step templates, your package repositories, and so forth.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what you're saying right there is that so if each space has its own step templates and NuGet packages and everything like that, I could create like that sandbox space where I could try out different things and mess around with step templates to see if that was going to work for me without affecting our other teams or other production instance.
That's correct. It's
Oh, nice.
effectively a hard wall. So you can do some, you can do your funky things in your sandbox, and it won't affect any of the other spaces.
Oh, very nice.
I think so too. So yeah, users are global, which definitely makes sense. This would be something, obviously, with that is just obviously with it being system-wide, this just makes sense. Teams can be global, but they can also exist within a space. That doesn't mean, obviously, what you can do there is, obviously, you've got your system teams like your Octopus administrators, and then what you also can do is set up a team, and it only exists within that space. Some tasks and events, such as auditing, do sit outside of spaces, which obviously, certain things like backups and so forth, well, obviously that will remain at the system level, whereas obviously, and auditing as well. But auditing does also come down per space as well.
Oh, nice.
So I've been using Octopus for a long time now, and as part of that, I've been an administrator of Octopus, and I've actually been in certain circumstances where I've been the only administrator of Octopus. And what that can mean is it's centralized to one person or a team or a help desk, and what it does lead to is those noisy interfaces. And you do see that, obviously, like I showed you earlier on. And also with this particular setup, what it does, it leads to roadblocks. For instance, I've worked very closely with developers in the past, and what does happen is they can wait an extended amount of time for things like project creation, new infrastructure to be added to Octopus, or even users to be added to the system. And what Spaces will do is, in line with DevOps best practices, is it will enable self-service. Because what Spaces does is it gives you the ability to give a space administrator or a space manager. This generally would be your team lead or a technical lead or a project lead, and this person then can manage their own space, and they don't have to worry about anything else that's happening in Octopus. They only have to worry about their particular space, and they can manage that fully without having to get help desk. Occasionally, obviously, they'll still have to do help desk, but that's certainly not to do with the way Spaces is configured.
That's nice, because I've been on the other side, where I've been a developer or a lead developer, and I always had to go to the Octopus administrators and ask them to do something like, hey, I need you to update a global variable from, sometimes it's something as simple as like, change this letter from an A to a C. And they're like, really? Like, yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And to be honest, the guys that are on both sides of it are really busy, so it really just cuts down time, administration time, and really you just get them much, much quicker.
Yeah.
Okay, let's jump into the demo.
All right. So you should be able to take control.
Excellent. One moment. Okay, you should now be able to see an Octopus instance.
Yep, I see it.
Excellent, excellent. So Bob, this is your default. This is your default, and this is an early access release just now. So you will see some of the little orange bar across the top. But this will be what you see as soon as you log on to Octopus once you've upgraded to the version with Spaces. This is your default space. As you can see here, you've got different projects down the left-hand side and different releases, and you've got your a dev, QA, and prod environment. As you can see here, you've got some listening tentacles. Tenants, there's no tenants configured.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a library here, and with your package, you've got your Octo Study package. And as you can see up in the top left-hand corner, this is your Spaces switcher. It's similar to some other platforms where you can just, top left-hand corner, just split between. And we'll start off with the blue team space. Again, similar to default, you've got your projects on the left-hand side. This is slightly different in that it's dev, test, and production. Again, different projects, different releases. Infrastructure. Again, this is actually an offline drop. This doesn't have tenants configured. And then finally, the red team space, you've got a separate set of projects and also grouped into project groups. And then again, you've got different environments. So this is one of the benefits, Bob, is you can have different, some customers have dev, QA, staging, prod. Generally this is roughly what you would normally see, but there's definitely different flavors here that you can configure. And it's similar. Here you've got your infrastructure, which in this instance is a cloud region. And then you've got tenants. In this instance, these are UK South and UK West, which is Azure regions. And then similar to here, you've got your packages, you've got a different package, different step templates and so forth. Okay, so what I want to do is switch back to the default group, and this default space, sorry, go to configuration. And what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to configure a space, and I want to take you through the creation of a space.
Okay.
So you come into configuration, you go into spaces, and as you can see, you've got your blue team space, you've got your default space, and then you've got your red team space. So what we're going to do is add a green team space. Helps if I can spell. And what we're going to do here is we're going to give Gillian, the green team lead, space manager access. So at this moment in time, I'm logged in, as you can see here, as the user Derek. Top left-hand corner, I'll drop down. I actually can't see the green space yet. The reason for that is that I don't have permissions to see this. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add myself. The reason I'm doing this just now is I just want to show this quickly. Okay, and then on the top left-hand corner, we've got a green space, and what we want to do is obviously we would like to make it green. Get a new logo.
The quick question is can you make those logos GIFs?
Bob, I believe so, yes. You can make them, so you can definitely get your party octopus on.
Yeah, that's right.
Looks like the 90s again as came back to revisit us.
That's right.
Okay, so what you can see here is the green team space. This is just you've saw this no doubt lots of times, Bob, where when you set up Octopus for the first time, you log on, and this is what you see.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So it's almost like you have a whole new Octopus server at this particular point in time.
Yeah, it ties into what you're discussing earlier on about the sandbox. So certainly this is it. You now have your own space where you can pretty much just get stuck in and do whatever you want.
Very cool.
Just one last thing that I would like to do is go to configuration and then come into Teams. So as I was discussing earlier on, Teams has the ability to have both system and spaces permission. So there will be certain organizations, like certain departments like QA, and again, I'd imagine maybe even DBAs. I'd imagine people like QA and DBA will likely span more than one project. Is that your experience, Bob?
Yeah, I've seen that happen. I worked at a place where I think a QA team was like responsible for something like 15 other teams or 15 other projects. I can't remember exactly how the ratio worked out, but having a QA team be able to access multiple team spaces or multiple spaces would be definitely very beneficial.
Yeah, and this is what Spaces does. So as you can see here, you've got your usual teams, everyone, Octopus administrators, Octopus managers, and so forth. So QA. So as you can see, QA has 3 members and permissions for default, blue team space, and the red team space. As we have configured the green team space now, and once you can see here, you've got, so project deployer is project deployer access to all project groups and all projects on test environment for all tenants. Similar project deployer for default, and then similar to red team spaces, they've got project deployer, all project groups in QA environment with all tenants. So what we want.
That's nice, because so I can scope my teams to just like I used to, where I could scope the teams to different environments or different project groups, everything like that.
Yeah, that hasn't changed. It's really just obviously it's made it much easier to implement. So in this instance,
nice.
what I'm going to do is give Project Deployer access. And then I'm going to select the newly created green team space and then select apply. So as you can see now, we've added the new permissions. So one thing I do just want to show you quickly, just before, is as you can see here, you've got the default project group and there is no projects or environments as we haven't created them yet in green, the green team space. So what we would have to do here is come back and configure this once these have been set up.
Oh, very nice.
So as you can see, Hank, Isabella, and Jack, and then obviously you just got your name. Select save. Okay. So what I want to do now is sign out, and then what I'm actually going to do is log on as Jillian.
What kind of password do you have for a test user? Jeez.
Security first, Bob. Security first. No, I've got a long password for everything. But yeah, as you can see, you know, green team space. We've logged on for the first time. You know, as I showed earlier on, this is what you would do. So what we're going to do first is let's get some people working, and within the configuration, you've got the audit section like we were discussing earlier on, and within audit, you actually only have you only have the spaces audit being viewable, which I think is really great.
Oh yeah, that's really nice. Just, you know, from a usability point of view, like I can just have a team lead or I can have a security person go, hey, you know, what changes been made just to the space, and can drill in really quickly. That's nice.
Well, that's it. And it then also means as well that security can talk directly to the teams rather than have to be like a sysadmin as well, or someone from ops. So you've got your teams here. So you've got, again, similar here. You've got your everyone, Octopus admins, managers, and QA, and space managers. So what we want to do is create a new team called developers. And like I was mentioning earlier on, Bob, this is accessible in the green team space only or accessible in all spaces. For this instance, this will be the green team development team. We'll hit save. So yeah, here we go. So firstly, what we want to do is include a project deployer access. Hit apply. And then you would like to add some members. So we're going to add Adam, as you can see, he's a developer. You're going to add Francine. And we're going to add Clint. There we go. We have Adam, Clint, and Francine now part of the green team. And then you hit save.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So that's nice. So that team is just for that space. So if you were to change over to default space, you wouldn't be able to see the developers team for green space. Well, I guess you can't even see default space because Jillian doesn't have access to it.
Well, that's it. As you can see here, the only thing you've got here is just the green team space. So even though Jillian is a team lead or a technical lead, she only has access to the spaces that she requires access to. So this is in line with security best practices, and obviously at least privilege. So yeah, you've got that in place. It's really, you know, and it's really straightforward. You know, I think it's going to make things much more straightforward and really easier to use and keep things a little bit more organized. Because as Octopus, as Octopus scales with your teams, then it will be a lot easier to, you know, using these features will be a lot easier to organize that.
All right, cool.
Excellent.
Ryan, do we have any questions coming in?
Yeah, we have a few questions. I'll ask 2 or 3 questions now, and then I can save some of the others for the end.
Absolutely.
So first question. Hi, Derek. Can libs span spaces, e.g. step templates and packages? So can we share those library elements, packages, step templates, variable sets across spaces?
Not at launch. I'm not sure I mentioned, but Spaces is launching in January. What we'll be doing is taking on some feedback, but by default, nothing in the library will be able to cross spaces. You'll be able to use, obviously you'll be able to create them, like similar to Bob's sandbox. If he wanted to do some sandbox, some testing on that with some scripts and starts from a different space, he can copy and paste those over. But no, there is no way to share those just now.
Cool. Thanks, Eric. Second question, is it possible to restrict users to just the audit side of things while restricting the other access they have within the space?
So they would only have access to see the audit log?
Correct.
I'm actually not too sure about that. I expect there would be a permission that we would be able to put in place, but that's something I would have to confirm. Bob, do you know that one by any chance?
I believe you would. I think if you go to user roles, there might be an audit user, or you might be able to create an audit user just with that particular permission.
Yeah.
And that permit it's under user roles.
Yeah. Okay.
There might just be an audit user, but I don't think there is, which makes sense. You might be able to create an audit user specifying I only want to view audit logs only for each space, and you could create a system team space probably for something like that.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks, Bob.
Yeah, no problem.
All right. Now, one more question, and then I'll save the rest till later. And then we can answer anything we don't answer during the webinar. We'll try and answer within the chat or within Slack at the end. So, so this is from Paul in Dublin. So hello, Paul. They have about 210 projects in their Octopus setup, and that covers 4 core products that they deploy to customer sites. And most of those 200 projects are microservices, and they're heavily tenanted. What they struggle with is the variables that they have to maintain across all of the projects and the loading time for the dashboard. Do you see spaces being used by your customers to better manage their use of microservices, variables, and how do we see it working with tenants?
That's a really good question. I think Spaces will definitely help that out. What you could likely do is, as you were saying there, you've got your 4 products. For instance, what you could probably do there is separate out into Spaces based on product. And then at that point, obviously, bring that down. So certainly it would help out. Yeah, it really will just make things a lot more easier to see and organize. But certainly Spaces would help in those circumstances. I think as well as that, as you scale, you may see some slow performing dashboard, and even just on that side of things, it will definitely help.
Cool, thanks. All right, so I'll keep watching for the questions, and I'll answer some as I go, and then we'll ask some more towards the end. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Ryan.
Cool. I'll go ahead and take back over control. All right. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about workers and how you can use them to speed up and scale out your Octopus Deploy server. So Derek, I'm sure you've seen this screen a lot when you add the run a script step.
Far too many times, Bob.
And you always have that question of where am I going to run this particular script? Sometimes it makes a lot of sense. You might run a script after you do an K8s deployment to maybe set some sort of variable or do something right on the deployment target. In that context, it makes a lot of sense. But other times it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Like I need to send out an email or I want to send out a Slack notification or something like that. In that particular case, you're going to run that on the Octopus Deploy server. Initially, the number of scripts and the number of things you ran on the Octopus Deploy server, it wasn't very much. You might have a couple PowerShell scripts. You might send some notifications, might maybe do a database script or two just to maybe do a backup or something like that. But it wasn't a whole lot of work that you're doing on the Octopus server itself. As time's gone on, we've added a lot of functionality specifically around deploying to cloud, as well as other types of deployments and scripts. And those types of cloud deployments, say to Kubernetes or Azure or AWS, you're not really deploying to like a target per se. You're deploying to an API and letting the API handle the rest. And so you have to ask your Octopus server to do a lot more work. So much so that it's entirely possible to have an entire deployment process, and this is something I created, and it deploys an entire application, but all the deployments occur right on the Octopus Deploy server. I'm not deploying to any target, like nothing's getting run on the target. So I'm asking Octopus Deploy server to handle all this deployment work. Now I want to kind of jump into step 3 and step 5 about that, because that's my database deployment. Let's highlight that a little bit. So I have my server in Omaha, Nebraska, and it's deploying to an Azure database in South Central US data center. In order to get that to work, I had to tell the Azure database firewall to allow any connection from my IP address in my from my server in Omaha. Derek, I imagine you could probably, that's not the best thing in the world to do.
Yeah, I'd imagine. Yeah, that let's be honest, security-wise, that's never going to get passed in your network team.
Yeah. In all fairness, I don't have a VPN set up, so I mean, there's a little bit of that, but yeah, that's. In addition to that, I also have to worry about latency. Now, the scripts I'm running now are really small. I just want to create a couple tables, so those run pretty quick. But if I was doing a bunch of work where I'm going to be requesting data and chunking through data and everything like that, I would experience quite a bit of latency between the two. And the way we kind of solved it in the past, and the way we were actually recommended in our documentation at this particular point in time, is to make use of a jump box. And within that jump box, we're still doing the deployment. We actually do the deployment to that jump box. And now the jump box is sitting on the same virtual network as the Azure database. I don't have to add the IP address, which solves that security concern. And latency should be pretty minimal because I'm in the same data center, and hopefully I have, the gigabit or 10 gigabit or however many gigabit connection to the database itself. So I kind of solved that, but I really didn't solve the latency problem. So let's pretend for a second this image has 300 databases. Well, if we're using a single jump box, we've created a pretty big single point of failure. So we only have one tentacle, and we're asking it to do a lot of work. Now you can kind of get around that problem with saying, okay, now this tentacle is responsible for these 20 or 30 databases. This tentacle is responsible for these 20 or 30 databases. But that doesn't really scale all that well. And you also created a kind of a single point of failure for all of your databases. So imagine that one tentacle were to go down. Well, now you can't deploy to those databases until you bring that tentacle back up, or that machine were to go down. If you're running all your tentacles on a single jump box, if that box were to go down, then all your database deployments were to stop. And so you haven't solved the problem completely. I'm going to jump away from that database deployment problem and talk a little bit about cloud deployments. In those cases, you're not really given a choice. You have to run this on the Octopus Deploy server because, again, you're not deploying to an actual target. You're just deploying to an API. Now, by default, and we see this a lot with our customers, by default, Octopus Deploy will run or be installed as local system. It is possible to set it up to run as a specific domain account. In fact, that's given to you in the UI when you set up the install. But then when you run a script, it could run under that account that the Octopus server is running under. Again, you can configure that, but that's through the CLI. And so it's not as apparent. And as a result, a lot of people are just running PowerShell scripts as the same user as the Octopus Deploy server. And I like to think that people are good-natured in heart. They don't really mean to do bad things, but people do make mistakes. And one messed up line in your PowerShell script could really ruin your day. You could end up with something like, oh, I'm going to format. I accidentally deleted my really important folder that has all my images on it. Whoops. Now, this was a screenshot that I took for when I was doing a deployment. And this, granted, this was on my VM, so I don't have a whole lot of processor power. I just only gave it 4 processors. I didn't give it a lot of memory, but this was just for a single project for a single person. So it doesn't scale all that well, because imagine if I had a couple hundred people on this, and yeah, I'd probably give it a little bit more resources. I would have maybe 8 processors and 16 gigs of RAM, but again, it doesn't scale all that well because, again, I'm asking my Octopus Deploy server to do all this extra work. Now, this is some software that I've installed on my Octopus Deploy server that I really didn't need to install. For Octopus Deploy to be installed, if you're doing it, say, on Windows Server 2016, you really don't need anything extra to install that Octopus Deploy server. Like, you don't need to have a specific version of like Azure PowerShell, because that all comes bundled in there. All you really need is your SQL server. And that's really about it. But to do a bunch of other things, like to do, say, Kubernetes deployments, I had to install kubectl. To do my database deployments, because it's a .NET Core package, I had to install .NET Core. I've done Redgate. I've done SMO, Node. I'm sure you've probably installed a few things in your time, Derek.
Yep. You got to love those NPM packages.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It just keeps on growing and growing on something like that. And that's a bit of a concern because you can end up with having to do a restart after you install something. For example, kubectl, I had to restart the service because that added a variable into the path or added a value into the path. And the Octopus Deploy server didn't see that until after a restart of the service. So I had to take down my entire CD pipeline just to do that one minor install. I also need a way to keep this software up to date. And again, this is maintenance you're doing on the Octopus Deploy server when really it should just be worried about orchestrating your deployments, not having to worry about all this extra software. Every once in a while, I've seen conflicts between software. It doesn't happen a whole lot, but when it does, it's just a bad day for everybody because you're trying to figure out what's going on. Why did this happen all of a sudden? Why has things stopped working? And you also might run into a similar issue with Windows dependencies. Now, again, it's not something you run into quite often, but again, when it happens, like a patch gets installed in Windows and it stops another piece of software from working, again, it's a really bad day when that happens. And that's where workers come into play. And that's what we hope to solve with workers. So you still have your production web servers, just like you've always had. And that's, you have your tentacles installed on those web servers. And maybe you have app servers or you have Linux servers using SSH. That's all still the same. But with workers, it's the way that we're organizing other machines. So you still install a tentacle on a worker. It's very similar, but instead of registering it as a target, you register it as a worker, and then you put it into a worker pool. So when you want to, say, deploy to, say, a CloudFormation script or something like that, then the worker that has the CloudFormation CLI or the AWS CLI installed on it, it would be leased out of the worker pool. The work would be done on it, and then it would be added back into that worker pool to be used in another deployment. So you can have as many items or as many workers in a single worker pool as you want. There's not really a theoretical limit, so to speak, but eventually you'll probably get a margin in diminishing returns, and maybe you might want to reorganize your workers slightly differently in that particular sense.
Bob, I'm just wondering, what's the difference between a tentacle and a worker?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of the installer, it's the exact same installer. So you still download a tentacle off our website and you install it on the machine. It's just the way that you register it. So all the communication is the exact same. So you can configure it to be a polling or a listening worker. That all works the exact same.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah. Let's get back to that database deployment scenario. So again, imagine I have a couple hundred databases. Now I can have a database worker pool, and these workers only have the required software to do those database deployments. So in my particular sense, I would just have .NET Core, maybe the SQL Server SDK installed on it or something like that. And when I want to do, say, a deployment to project A, it might pick worker 2 because that one's not working, and that one's not doing any work, excuse me. And it can go ahead and do that deployment for me. Now, the nice thing about that is that, so let's say worker 1 were to go down. Well, worker 2 and worker 3 can be there and pick up the slack. We actually had a question in our webinar yesterday about what happens if a worker is marked as unhealthy, and I did some testing around that. It's just not picked. It's not considered to be leased out of the worker pool. It's just ignored at that particular point in time. And so you get around that single point of failure, but you also increase your scalability because as you add more databases, maybe you say, okay, we're starting to see our deployments take a little bit longer. Maybe we just need to add in an additional worker to help that out, help out that load. So for this demonstration, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my OctoStudy project that we showed earlier, and we're going to convert this to use workers. So first, I want to do a quick release of this, and I have my task manager open, and we're going to take a look at what it looks like when I do a deployment. So I'm going to go ahead and deploy this to dev. And so this is running, every deployment is running on the server. And I'll show you what that looks like. I don't know what that little graph is. That's cool. Different. So you can see it's doing quite a bit. And I think in one of our runs, I saw it spike all the way up to 100%. That was like a weird thing that happened once. I haven't seen it do that since, but you can see it's kind of going a little crazy with all the work it's being asked to do. And again, 4 CPUs, I don't know, 8 gigs of RAM is what I gave it. I think it's only consuming 5 at this particular point. And I did pre-run this before this webinar. So literally all it's doing is just doing a deployment. It's not trying to install any additional software or anything like that. But as you can see, it did consume quite a bit of resources while I did that. And we can also look in the task log and we can see it ran everything on the Octopus server itself. So I'm going to dive into my process. And the whole point of this is what we want to do is we want to change every one of these steps except for the manual interventions. Those still have to run on the Octopus Deploy server. But all the other steps, they can run on different worker pools. Before I do that, I do want to highlight this run a script step because I think it's really important. We recently made a change to this. We added a new feature where now you can actually reference packages in this step. And what's really nice about this is you can pick the feed, you can pick the package ID and everything like that. You can extract that package during the deployment or during when that script is going to be run. So in my PowerShell script, I'm actually referencing that extracted path location because I might want to do, in this case, I'm doing a very simple database deployment. In fact, I'm just generating a diff report to see what's about to run. And once it's done with this work, that area, that package extraction will be deleted. Like that folder will be deleted because we don't need to keep that folder there anymore because we weren't deploying to that target. We weren't deploying to that worker. We just needed that package to be extracted to do a little bit of work. One particular case, I worked with a customer and they wanted to have the ability to run a script that would take package contents and copy it to a file share. And they're saying, well, what target should I run this on? Like you should run this on a worker because you can reference packages this way. And I think once we added this feature, this was really what made workers very, very valuable because it solved quite a bit of problems. So I have this step, and this is going to be the first step that I'm going to change. And this is just a simple PowerShell script that I wrote. And basically, if I'm doing a deployment to production between 7:30 a.m. and 7:15 p.m., then it's going to require a manual intervention. And right now, it's running on the server. It says a default worker pool, and I'll show you why why it says that in just a second. But the big reason is because I added a bunch of worker pools to, to help this webinar go a little bit faster. But once you do that, this UI changes from run once on an Octopus server to run once on a worker. It's just that's the reason why. So I'm going to change this. Instead of running on the default worker pool, I want to run this on a new worker pool I'm going to create. So you can create your worker pools in the infrastructure tab. And just to point out a couple of things with the worker pools, with the default worker pool, if you don't have any machines in the default worker pool, then that work will be ran on the Octopus Deploy server. And in an upcoming release, we're going to make that a little bit more apparent in the UI as to what's happening. And the reason we know this is the default worker pool is because if we come in and edit it, it actually says, yep, this is the default worker pool. We don't match on the string name. That'd be crazy. I have a couple other worker pools that I set up for this, but I'm going to add a new one to run my PowerShell script. So I'm going to call this PowerShell script worker pool. And I'm going to go ahead and add a worker to this. So this is going to be a Windows tentacle that I had pre-installed on a virtual machine. So I'm just going to copy this URL, add this. And as you can see, this is very similar interface to installing a tentacle. In fact, it actually says the tentacle must be configured to trust the Octopus server and everything like that. It's just a tentacle. It's just the way that we're organizing how we're referencing that tentacle in our Octopus Deploy server. So I'm going to go ahead and hit next. And it found it. So I'm just going to call this PS worker. Now, if you're registering a regular tentacle, you would be presented with the option of adding it to an environment or adding it to a role. We're not doing that here. Instead, we're going to go ahead and just add this to a worker pool. And that's all we're going to be presented with right now. And then give it this, give it the thumbprint, give it anything else. Very similar user interface. Go ahead and click on save. And we can connect the connectivity, which it just found it, so it should just be fine. Come on. One thing I do want to point out, speaking of adding workers, and I want to get back to that default worker pool before I forget. If you were to add a new machine to the default worker pool right now, you're actually going to be presented with a warning. So I'm going to go ahead and just add that machine again. 1933. Oh, pretend I'm going to add it. And it'll give you a warning. It says adding workers to the default worker pool will turn off the built-in worker. And what that means is that all the work that was previously done on your Octopus Deploy server is now going to be done on another machine. That could be intentional, but just be aware of that, because you might have software installed on your Octopus Deploy server that you might have to suddenly install on this new worker. I'll get into some tips and tricks on this, but I just want to make you aware of that. So I'm not going to add this to that worker pool right now.
Bob, does that mean you can disable the built-in worker so no custom scripts can happen on the Octopus server?
Yep, that's what that's going to do for you.
Excellent.
So that's a good way to do that. But just be aware when you make that change that it's going to be quite a big bang if you're not prepared for it. So I'm going to change this working hours check to, so now it says I'm going to run this on a worker. I'm going to run this on my PowerShell script worker pool and go ahead and click on save. And that's it. So let's go ahead and create a release and we'll take a look at this. And typically this deployment doesn't take very long. Now, the majority of the work that happens is being done on doing the actual deployment. So like the database deployments, the Kubernetes deployment, the Azure App Service deployment. So we're not going to see a big performance boost in this particular sense. The idea is that I moved my PowerShell scripts from running on my Octopus Deploy server now running on a different server. And you can see it actually picked a worker. And if you have multiple workers in the worker pool and you want to know what worker actually did the work, if you change your log level to verbose, you can see right here that it picked that PS worker from the PowerShell script worker pool. It only picked that. The big reason why I picked that is because it's the only one in there. And I think there's an algorithm that determines which worker to pick from or which worker to use in a worker pool. But when you only have one, that algorithm is super simple. So that's how you change the worker. Change that step to run on a worker. I'm going to go ahead and change all these other ones. And as I'm doing this, you'll notice that I have different worker pools configured. So I have a database deployment worker pool. I have a Kubernetes worker pool. And the big reason for that is because these machines only have the necessary software installed on it. So for example, the Kubernetes worker pool, it only needs to have kubectl installed on it. I don't have anything else installed on this machine. The other nice thing about this is I can go ahead and I can scale up based on my need or based on the application of the deployment type I'm doing. So for example, let's say you're doing a bunch of Kubernetes deployments. This is Azure, right? Yep, this is Azure. You're doing a bunch of Kubernetes deployments. Well, maybe you need a whole bunch of workers to handle that, but maybe you're only doing 1 or 2 Azure deployments. Well, maybe you only really need 1 worker in that particular sense. So it allows you to scale up based on the deployment type that you're doing.
Bob,
yeah.
It looks like you can assign worker pools to steps. Is it possible to bind them to a variable and then change the worker pools as you promote it through a release?
That's an excellent question. So at this particular point, you cannot, but that is going to be, oops, that's not the right one. But that is going to be changing in an upcoming release where you'll have the ability to bind this to a variable. And then just like before, you can bind variables to something that can be scoped. So that will be coming in an upcoming release.
Awesome. Thanks, Bob.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm going to go ahead and create this release. And now we're going to take a look at what this looks like. It's very similar to before. Let's open up the old task manager and just take a look at what's going to happen while we're doing this. And the first step always seems to take a little bit more just because I think it's that acquire package steps always takes a little bit more effort. And you can see it's going a little hog wild as I'm doing all this extra work. But once I started doing that, you can kind of see it's getting a little bit more flat in this particular sense. And one of our run-throughs, I think it was almost completely flat. It's just how it feels that particular second. But you can see that it is much less of a load that I'm putting on this Octopus Deploy server as we're doing this deployment.
It also looks like, Bob, it also looks like you're consuming less memory and network and disk as well. Is that the expected behavior?
Yeah, that is expected behavior, especially if the step that you're running is very memory intensive or disk IO intensive. That is completely within the realm of reason to see something like that.
Excellent. That's a big reduction.
Yeah, unfortunately, in this particular sense, these are pretty small packages, so the disk IO isn't as much, but you can see that it's virtually 0 now, and my Ethernet, my Ethernet IOPS is really, really low as well. Again, I'm not doing a whole lot of work in this particular sense, but it definitely kept everything nice and steady. And so that, in a nutshell, is how I've configured this one particular project. Oops, I did want to jump in and show you that, yep, it is in fact, it ran everything on the Octopus on the actual workers themselves. So you can see worker, did everything on there. And if you do want to see which worker was picked, again, you change it to the verbose log. And then the acquire package. I don't know why Octopus server pops in here because it's not doing anything. It just, I'm going to do it.
Ran for 0 seconds.
It ran for 0 seconds and didn't do any work, but these other ones actually did stuff. So it just, yeah, that's fine. But yeah, I thought that was, it's a really helpful way to scale out your Octopus Deploy server on something like that. We were asked in our last one, I did want to address with this, is there a fast way that you can spin up and down workers? And I'm using infrastructure as code in this particular sense. Since I'm deploying to Azure, I'm using an ARM template to create my worker VM. And then as part of that ARM template, I'm also automatically installing the tentacle. I have to do a couple of funky things because this machine is running on my local laptop. So Azure isn't aware of all my IP addresses and everything like that. So I had to write a couple extra scripts to handle that, but it is automatically, when it's all said and done, when this project runs, everything automatically registers itself with my Octopus Deploy server and adds the worker into the worker pool for me.
So does that mean that we can have dynamic workers and worker pools? So you can scale up?
Yeah, that's a dynamic. It's like dynamic workers and worker pools. That is something that we're working on right now because we need to solve it for a couple of other problems internally. But that's definitely something we want to add. But as of right now, this would be a good way, like a good compromise to help scale everything up for you. Okay. And you can see I have my GIF icon. So I have this project that kicks off all my other projects.
You have to send me that GIF, please, Bob.
It's on our Slack, believe it or not.
I'll grab it. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So Ryan, do they have any questions coming in for this?
Oh man, do we have some questions?
Good.
Cool. So you showed the Windows worker. Is there an equivalent for Linux?
There is a Linux. Yep, you can absolutely. Let me go ahead and do this. Worker pools. Go ahead and add a worker. So you can reference SSH connection for this.
Cool. So that's just like setting up a Linux deployment target, but you'd be setting it up as a worker.
Absolutely. Yep.
All right. This is a good question. This is from Ian. If you have a new worker in the default pool and all the workers run on that, what happens with manual intervention steps?
So the manual intervention steps will still be running on the Octopus Deploy server. Even if you change your default worker pool, those just have to run on the Octopus Deploy server. You don't get a choice in that particular sense. Same thing with, and that's actually bring up another good point, and this has been asked a couple times by other people. Your health checks will also continue to run on the Octopus Deploy server because it needs to be able to test. I can actually connect to the workers to do the work, and I can also I can connect to the targets. So those will still run on the Octopus Deploy server.
Okay, how many tasks can you run simultaneously on a worker?
That's a really good question. So we were actually talking to the engineers the other day about this, and they said, unlike targets or traditional targets, like you deploy an IIS or something like that, we don't use the mutex for the workers, so you can run multiple concurrent tasks. The big reason why we had that mutex was specifically say around like you want to deploy Windows Service or you want to deploy IIS. Well, if you had multiple tasks, you might get some weird sort of IIS metabase conflict or something like that. But with workers, what we saw is that I'm doing a deployment, say a database. Well, I don't really have a lot of resource contention on the actual worker itself. So,
all right,
really limited by probably your CPU and your disk and your RAM resources in that particular sense.
All right. One more question. Do workers have a dependency on SQL for task configuration storage?
Task configuration storage? I don't believe so, because I just installed my workers and I'm not telling it where to. I'm not connecting it to my SQL server in that particular sense. I just installed the tentacle.
So it's just running. So all of their information stored in the Octopus server database.
So the workers, like where the worker is installed and where it extracts packages and everything like that, that's stored on a configuration on the actual machine. where the work, like how when you register the worker with Octopus Deploy server, that registration is stored in the Octopus Deploy database and the SQL database.
Very good. All right, I'll hold the rest of the questions till the end.
All right, perfect. So I'm going to go back into here. A couple tips to get started. First, I'm going to cover workers, and then Derek will help us out with some spaces tips. Avoid adding that machine to the default worker pool until you're 100% ready. I actually recommend setting up other worker pools in this particular sense, and then converting your steps over to use those new worker pools so you don't just have this big bang. But that really only works if you are on a license that allows unlimited workers, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. If you're on a license that only allows one worker, then I would set up that set up that one worker as a separate machine and then add it to the default worker pool. But just be aware when you do that. I like to set up worker pools per deployment type. I talked through that just a little bit. I think it's a really good way for organization. And then also leverage infrastructure as code to spin up and down workers. It's a great way to just, if I need to add workers really quickly, it's a really fast way to do something like that. In addition to that, you don't have to use like Azure or AWS or anything like that. If you're doing stuff on premise, you can leverage some of the APIs. I think VMware has a pretty good API and Hypervisor has a pretty good API. Derek.
Start planning. One of the things is I'd recommend is start planning how your space organization will look. It could well be based on team, application type, organizational group. Really, I would definitely start thinking about it, and where possible, start looking at a proof of concept. Really, where possible, as soon as it's out, there would be nothing. There would be nothing against spinning something up as soon as possible and start planning it and doing some testing. But definitely start with a proof of concept, and then obviously what you'll be able to do is start planning how you start cutting up and start creating your spaces.
Absolutely. Licensing for our legacy licenses, community, team, professional, enterprise, you get one worker and one space. So when we say one worker, you can actually configure an additional server. So you can offload all that work that your Octopus Deploy server is doing right now onto a single worker. And you get one space, which is the default space. For standard, you get unlimited workers and you get 3 spaces. And then for our HA, data center, and cloud customers, they get unlimited workers and unlimited spaces. If you're curious as to what license you have and how you can upgrade or anything along those lines, please contact us at sales@octopus.com. We'll be more than happy to help you out and provide you with the necessary recommendations and options for you. All right, let's hear the questions, Ryan.
All right, so here's another question from Ian. Is the preferred base setup now to always set up run on a worker versus the Octopus server? So even if it's running on the same physical server, is it advisable to have it running on an external worker?
I would think so from a security point of view, because you can configure, even if you're running that worker on the same server, you can configure that worker to run as least principal, so like privilege. So you can configure it to run as, like, say, a specific user account or something like that. So you limit it what it can do. That would definitely be, I would prefer it if I was setting it up from scratch.
On spaces, what about migrating spaces or migrating projects and infrastructure from one space to another, Derek?
Excellent question. Initially, you won't be able to move them. Everything will be in the default space, but what will happen is a follow-up release where we'll be releasing a space migrator, so you can move things from between spaces. This could be from space 1 to space 2, or the default space over to your, however you set it up. So yeah, there will be a migrator being released within a couple of months of spaces launching.
Another spaces question, can a project span multiple spaces, i.e. can you have multiple teams responsible for one project?
And that would be, in short, not at once. You wouldn't be able to share projects, but you wouldn't be able to share projects across spaces. So no, I don't think.
So another good question related to spaces. When using Team City, so this comes from Anthony in the UK, When using TeamCity as a build server, do we need to add the space to push to Octopus?
Yes. By default, if you're set it up currently, what will happen is your TeamCity will post into your default space. What you would have to do is also add in your package feed per space as well.
All right, let's see. Related to workers, Bob, are the workers new individual VMs or machines, or are they still your web servers that share the responsibility?
I would probably set them up as new VMs in this particular sense and leave your web servers just focused on hosting websites. And that's the way that I had mine set up as well. And that's why I see a lot of people using them. Think of them kind of like, if you go back to that database deployment example at the very, very beginning, think of them like a bunch of jump boxes.
Is it possible to configure a deployment process specifying only the worker pool and no targets?
So would you want, so I guess if you wanted to deploy just to the workers, yeah, you could do that. You would have to do something like a platform as a service like Azure or something like that. And if you wanted to deploy to IaaS from a worker, you could if you really wanted to, but that's a lot of scripting. Basically, you'd have to figure out how to do all that scripting.
Right. Your demo showed that because you were deploying to Kubernetes. So all of your steps were deploying to workers. You
Yeah,
didn't
absolutely.
have any target steps.
Yep.
Yeah. So there's no requirement to have a target, especially if you're using things that lend themselves well to workers.
Well, I do want to clarify that a little bit. I do have targets. So if I look at, I have Azure Web App targets and Kubernetes targets.
Oh, right. Yes.
But when I did my deployment, everything was being done. So when I deployed to Kubernetes, it was a worker on behalf of my cluster, or it was a worker on behalf of my Azure app service.
All right. I got one more worker question. And
Okay.
then if there's any follow-up questions, like I said, we can take those to Slack. We can hang around for a little bit and answer questions that anybody has.
Okay.
But last worker question. So dedicated workers are recommended or not? So not shared with the normal tentacles. So I think this is kind of related.
Yeah, I
to
would
the
say,
previous question.
yeah, it depends on what your target is. If it's an app service, like a production app server that's hosting a bunch of Windows services, or it's your production web servers or something like that, I would definitely not reuse those tentacles. I would set up additional virtual machines. In a future release, when we have the ability to scope worker pools to variables, it might make a lot more sense, say in a dev environment where you share a bunch of resources. So you could have like your dev web server could also be your dev worker server. You could do something like that. But for production, I would absolutely not reuse tentacles in that sense, because you don't want to have resource contention.
All right. Sounds good. So yeah, any follow-up questions, any more questions, please head over to Slack. I think we'll probably send something out related to questions too. Haven't decided what form that takes yet, but yeah, thank you everyone for the questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can also reach out to us directly. We'd be more than happy to answer any questions you have. These are our email addresses as well as our Twitter handles. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. We hope you learned something new.
Thanks, everybody, as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep. All right, gonna go ahead and stop sharing, and let's end this.
Awesome. I'll see you guys in Slack.
See you guys.